Chapter 10. After the reception, Matt went back to the cabin his sister shared with her new husband. They would be back in a couple days, and he didn't want to be in their way when they returned. But he wasn't going home quite yet. Nick had already invited him to move into the main house. He could have started out there, but he'd wanted to spend the time he could with JV and Steve before the wedding. He had something important he needed to talk to Steve and the clan leader about, but he had put off doing it until after the wedding. He didn't want to ruin the big day, so he would hang around a while longer. Falling back onto the sofa, he dropped his head against the back and looked up at the white ceiling. His mind drifted back to the ceremony. Standing there, looking at Alex across the aisle and the scent of her. Her sweet clean scent and the musk of her desire blending together. His cock twitched and his pants grew snug. Just the memory of her scent was enough to make him rock hard. There was no question in his mind that he was drawn to her, and she to him. He just wasn't sure why or how long it would last. He was half afraid it was mating instinct. After having watched his sister and Steve, he knew that if he chose to leave, to just walk away, he would survive, and so would she. But he also knew that he may never find another potential mate, and if he did, there was no guarantee that she would feel the same for him. On the other hand, he didn't know if he was ready to get into another serious relationship. He'd gone through a dark time after losing Connie. He was finally through the darkness, but he didn't know if he had it in him to care for someone like that again. And even if he could, was he willing to risk that kind of pain again? He didn't want to start something with Alex if he couldn't be as invested in the relationship as she was. It wouldn't be fair to either of them. Closing his eyes, he wished he could just go home. The easiest thing to do would be just to keep his distance from her. To stay away until he had time to think about it and make up his mind. Unfortunately, he had to stay. There was something he needed to tell Steve and Nick, and it had to be done this trip. It had waited the week he'd been here, but it wouldn't wait for him to go home and come back again. He sat there thinking about what he had to do, trying to keep thoughts of Alex from slipping in until he fell asleep. He woke several hours later, stiff and uncomfortable, and stumbled to the bedroom and the cold bed waiting for him. Matt sat and watched as the Khan of his sister's clan stood to take charge of the meeting. Quiet down. We have a couple things we need to address tonight. We're not just here to chat. Nick scowled as his eyes scanned the room. There weren't many people there, and Matt knew Nick hated that they had to keep these meetings secret. Nick had told him as much. He'd also said if they didn't, they would never get anything done. First item on the agenda is the Khan of the Yellowstone clan has, through a third party, contacted me. They want to set up a visit. His eyes stayed on Rebecca. Matt knew he was watching her for even the slightest reaction. She'd grown up in the Yellowstone clan, and she had been supposed to marry the Khan before she'd fled. He'd only learned these details when he'd gone to the other man with the news that the Yellowstone clan had contacted him. Matt watched the Karen almost as carefully as her mate. He liked her, and didn't want anything to happen to her, or that baby she carried. She looked at her other half without flinching, but one hand ran over her swollen belly and she shifted in her seat. He knew she had to be having a hard time getting comfortable, the bigger she got. Connie had. He pushed Connie from his mind and focused on here and now. We don't have to let them come, but we should at least consider it, and send back a carefully phrased response instead of just a no. The Khan looked over the small group watching him. He seemed to be waiting for someone to say something. Can I make a suggestion? Matt asked. He had been included in this meeting for a couple of reasons, the biggest of which being that he was the third party Steve had mentioned. Nick's gaze came to rest on him. By all means. Consider using a neutral location. Somewhere you're comfortable but not your home. Matt glanced around the room. His gaze fell on JV, her head tilted to one side as she waited for him to continue. If you meet them somewhere else, they aren't in your home. They're not in your territory at all. You can negotiate who is allowed, who isn't, and what kind of security is there, without worrying about your entire pack. You can take whoever you want with you, but if it were me, I wouldn't be allowing people you're this leery of into your territory. He watched the others as they watched him back, waiting. That's not a bad idea, Steve said, turning to Nick. If you want to just say no, I'll back you 100%. But they may go to the council and claim you're keeping her from her family. Holding her hostage, so to speak. We all know it's not true, but that would cause a big drama. One you could win in the end, but do you want to have to go through that? It might be a good idea to pick a place and just meet them on your own terms. Nick looked at Rebecca, as if he wanted her opinion. I'd like to see my mom, my brothers and sisters if I can. I know to see them I'll have to see my father, but I have no desire to see their con. Nick looked back at Matt. Do you think that would be possible? To keep him from being there? Matt was quiet for a moment, thinking about exactly what had been said to him when he'd been approached. It may be. When he came to me, he said that he would like to set up a visit between his clan and you. He didn't say he wanted to see you, either of you. He looked at Rebecca, then back to Nick. He may have been looking for you to visit your family all along. You won't know until you start negotiating. Nick looked at him for a few seconds, then his eyes went to Rebecca. They seemed to be communicating just between themselves. After several moments, he looked away. I need you to figure out a good place to set this up. He looked at Steve. And determine what kind of security team we'll need, before I can send back terms. Can do, Steve said, making a couple notes on the notepad in his hand. Nick turned back to Matt. Can you hang out here a couple more days until I have that information, and can send back an offer? I have just that 2 more days. But after that, you could call or message me the details. I can, but I'd prefer not to. He paused a moment and scanned the room before his eyes stopped on Matt again. I never asked. Do you mind being our go-between on this? I don't feel like I really have a choice. Well, maybe I do. They came to me. I could have chosen not to tell you. To just stay out of it and keep my mouth shut, or to tell them no. But I chose to come to you, so no, I guess I don't mind, but thanks for asking. He dipped his head to the con. Sir, Steve's voice made them look in his direction. Phoenix would be convenient for us, but personally, I think it's too close to home. We could go pretty much anywhere large or small, but what might be best is Denver. He met Matt's gaze. Do you think your con would mind? I don't think so, but I can check. What's your relationship with your clan? Nick sat on the edge of the table near where Rebecca sat. Not bad. Matt shrugged. We're not best buddies, and I'm not at the top of the pecking order. In fact, I've been pretty inactive, but he understood why I couldn't handle the clan thing, and we're good. If you'd rather, I can make the request. Steve put in. Or I can, Nick added. If you think it would come across better. No, it's not a problem. I'll call and set up a meeting when I get back and clear it with him. Hang on a sec, Julio Roberts, the clan's cadre, spoke up for the first time since the Khan had called the meeting to order. What is your clan standing with the Yellowstone clan? Are they going to expect you to be their ally? Matt honestly didn't know. Tilting his head, he thought about it for several seconds. I'm not really sure, but I'll check when I contact my Khan, before I contact theirs. If there's a conflict, I'll be in touch. Because while I don't know the whole story, I know enough to know I'm not their ally. Good to know, Julio said, turning to Nick. I see no problems with the plan. I'll be more than happy to take care of things while you're gone, but let me suggest that you either do this thing in the next few weeks, a month at the most, or put it off for at least 4 months, if not longer." His eyes flicked to Rebecca, then slid down to her swollen belly. Every eye in the room followed his gaze, even Rebecca's. One hand slid protectively back and forth over her belly. "He's right. We do it now or it waits," Rebecca said. "Your preference, kitten?" Nick kept his voice soft as he lifted her chin with one finger until their gazes met. "I don't have one. I know you'll keep us safe either way." Matt could see the love and trust in her face as she looked up at him. It made his heart ache and his mind flip back to Alex. She could look at him like that someday, just as Connie had. But he'd been unable to protect her. Talk swirled around him, but it didn't involve him, and he closed his eyes and tried to clear his mind. He couldn't. Images of Connie after the accident, her lifeless body, still swollen with their child, burned into his mind. Only this time, she wore Alex's face. The shock of the image nearly took his breath away, and he shot to his feet, desperate to get out of there. "You all right, Matt?" JV's voice penetrated the haze in his brain. "Yeah, I just need a little air." He looked at Nick. "You mind if I step outside for a moment?" "Go ahead, we'll fill you in on anything you need to know." Concern was apparent in Nick's eyes. Matt made it outside, closed the door and leaned against it. He took several deep breaths before staggering off the porch and toward the little cabin where his sister lived. He was almost to the porch of the small cabin when he started stripping out of his clothes. Sitting on the step, he pulled off his shoes, set them beside him, and dropped the rest of his clothes on top. He bent to one knee and pictured his cat form. Once he could see the cougar who lived inside him in his mind, he willed his body to take that form. His vision blurred then cleared again. This time, he saw more detail in the dim evening light. With a snort, he bounded off into the surrounding trees, hoping to clear his mind. He ran, leaping over downed trees, darting through thickets. Branches caught on his coat and tugged, but he never slowed down. He was trying to outrun the ghosts in his mind, and it wasn't working. He just kept moving until his muscles ached and his lungs burned. Then he slowed to a walk but kept going. Once he'd caught his breath again, he took off running once more. He'd lost track of time and didn't know how long he'd been gone as he slowly made his way back to his sister's cabin. He found his clothes folded neatly on top of his shoes, sitting in one of the chairs on the porch. Obviously they'd come home and found them. Someone, probably JV, had folded them up for him so he could find them in the dark. Not that he would have had a hard time with his cat's vision. He focused on his human form. Willing his body to change, he waited until the transition was complete before getting dressed and heading back to the main cabin to see if he'd been locked out for being so late.